All right, here we go with Game 10 of the World Chess Championship. This is our quick recap. Magnus has the white pieces. He's up 3 games with 5 games remaining. He chooses e4. And again, we see e5 by Jan, and they go into another Petrov defense. Who will deviate first in this game? And it's Magnus. He plays knight takes e5 on move 3. This is going back to a mainline Petrov. In game 8, he played pawn to d4 here. So we're going to get a similar structure, though. Pawn to d6, knight to d3, and this is the first rare move by Magnus. This is not seen very often at the high levels, and again, it's the theme of the whole match. Magnus tends to be the player that makes the first rare move in almost every single game so far. Knight takes e4 by Jan, queen to e2, pinning this knight to the king, queen e7, and knight to f4. This has kind of a cool threat. Knight can head to d5, hitting the c7 pawn, and this black queen is overworked trying to defend c7 and e4. So kind of an interesting line by Magnus. Knight to f6 by Jan, and now it looks like Jan might be happy to trade queens this game. Maybe he's having a flashback to game number 8 with that famous 10 queen e1 check by Magnus. That was a really strong positional idea. I think Jan wants the queens off the board this game, and he might even be okay with the draw. Pawn to d4 by Magnus. So far, both players are playing quickly. It's a very slight advantage for Magnus just because he was able to move first in a symmetric position and compare the knight and pawn to the knight and pawn for black. You could maybe argue this knight on f4 is slightly stronger than the knight on f6. Now we see knight c6 by Jan, and according to Stockfish, this is a very slight inaccuracy. And Magnus goes into a deep think here, spending 19 minutes on his reply. First big think of the game. I think he was trying to either recall his prep or decide how much risk he wants to take in this game. c3 was played, but Stockfish says bishop to e3 was pretty interesting here. A sample line is bishop to f5, knight to c3, already threatening queen to b5, forking the b7 pawn and the bishop. So bishop e3 blocks the queen trade and gives Magnus some ways to play for a win, but it also could make the game a bit dicey. You know, if black queenside castles and white kingside castles, for example, then we could get pawn storms on opposite sides. But in this position, Stockfish does like white, and it's up to a half a pawn advantage. So very interesting choice by Magnus to play h-c3. It seems like he actually wants the queens off the board and wants to play lower risk, which does make sense being that he's up 3 games in the match. Pawn to d5. Now we see knight to d2 by Magnus heading to f3. Knight to d8 by Jan. And this move does look strange at first. Why put the knight back on the 8th rank? The plan is to reroute this knight to e6 and trade off for the strong f4 knight, which is pressuring the pawn on d5. Knight to f3. And at this point we have an hour and 26 for Magnus, an hour and 54 minutes for Jan, and the f3 knight is looking to come to the e5 square next. And again, close to equal, maybe a very, very slight pull for Magnus. Now we see finally Jan trades queens, and this should be close to equal, like I said. Bishop to d6, and at this point, if you're watching this from home and thinking, can I learn anything from this game in terms of the strategy? So far it's been pretty dry. Yes, you can. These players are now looking at all the imbalances in the position. Can they get a bishop pair? Can they create a good bishop against bad bishop, or a good knight against bad bishop? So one of the things the players both want to do is trade off the bishops that match the colors of their pawns, right? So black's bishop on c8 matches the d5 pawn and matches an eventual pawn on c6. Black wants to trade the c8 bishop off, and similarly, white wants to trade off the c1 bishop. So keep those ideas in mind. So here we see castle by both sides, bishop to d3 by Magnus, rook e8, rook e1, all natural developing moves. The sets of rooks come off the board, and now knight e6 by Jan. Good move, trying to trade off the passive knight for the active knight on f4. So the trade is pretty much forced. And Magnus plays g3, and if Magnus were playing, for example, a 1600 rated player, he's playing a very effective plan because he's actually applying pressure in a position that the computer says is equal. The plan here is knight to g2, bishop f4, trade off the bad bishop, which is going to give him a slight pull if Jan doesn't react quickly. So Jan plays pawn to g6, actually going for the same plan. Knight h5, knight g7, and offer the bishop trade. So we see knight to g2 by Magnus, rook to e8, and now pawn to f3. It looks like a quiet move, but it's actually threatening pawn to g4, which is a very strong idea, blocking the bishop f5 trade and blocking this reroute of the knight to g7. So it's forcing Jan to be stuck with that imbalance with the bad bishop. It's a very nice move by Magnus f3. So we see knight h5, king f2, and at this point, pawn to g4 is not so good, because after knight to g7, there's probably a real quick f5 for black, breaking this open. So that's why Magnus didn't play g4 at this point. He goes king f2, pawn to c6, solidifying the d-pawn, g4, knight g7. Now watch out, Magnus. h2 pawn is hanging. You definitely don't want to drop that pawn. Bishop to f4. And here we see Magnus getting the bad bishop traded off. Bishop takes, knight takes. And in this position, h4 is actually a threat here. And Jan spots this and plays g5. So you don't want to allow your opponent to play h4 and start to put the squeeze on your position, especially now that that bishop isn't being traded for the bishop on d3. Right, so Jan cannot allow h4. He finds a good move, pawn to g5. And after knight e2, this position, it does look dry still, but h4 is a threat again. Jan has to keep aware of these threats. And he plays pawn to f5, forcing Magnus to play a bit passive with h3. King comes up, rook h1. And at this point, the players start to speed up. And when they speed up, usually it means they're okay with agreeing to a draw. They kind of know as super GMs how to trade everything down and get to that move 40, which is the requirement to agree to a draw. We see f4 by Magnus, and I think this was kind of the final move that's saying, hey, I'm okay with the draw. I pushed you a little bit, Jan, put you under just slight pressure, but I know I'm up 3 games. There's only 4 games after this remaining. I'm good with trading everything off. So we see f takes g, h takes, and this pawn is attacked, but this pawn on h6 is also attacked. And this ends up happening. So bishop takes g4, rook takes h6. Jan finally offers the trade of the bad bishop. Take, take, rook h7. Jan blocks with the knight. And it looks like it's a free pawn for Magnus, but this pawn will be scooped up in just a couple of moves. King g6. Now in my notes here I said this game is heading to a draw, I think, because we have seen some surprises in this match. Rook h3, king takes g5, but now everything is symmetric. Knight for knight, rook for rook, pawns are identical, kings are in similar spots. It's really hard to see how either side can play for a win here. King e7, knight f4, king d6, knight g6. Magnus is trying to route his knight to this strong e5 square. Rook e6, knight e5. Be careful, Jan. Don't allow rook f7 and rook d7 checkmate. We've seen 3 blunders by Jan. An endgame table-based blunder that was really difficult to spot. And then he blundered a pawn in his second loss. And then in the third loss, he blundered a piece. So I'm wondering if the next blunder by Jan will be bigger than blundering a piece. And it could be blundering a checkmate after knight e5. He plays knight e8. We see rook f7 threatening the checkmate, but Jan plays rook to f6 check. Trades the rooks. We're at move 40. King e3 is played. They shake hands and agree to a draw. So that's game 10. We still have a 3-game lead for Carlsen. 4 games remaining. Make sure to subscribe to this channel if you're a new viewer. We have recaps after every game. So tomorrow is a rest day, and Saturday I will be back with a recap. Friday I'll be back with the recap. Tomorrow's a rest day. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.